Verse 1. Now the Philistines fought against Israel. The Israelites fled before them, and many fell dead on Mount Gilboa. The Philistines were in hot pursuit of Saul and his sons. They killed his sons, Jonathan, Abinadab, and Malchishua. The fighting grew fierce around Saul, and when the archers overtook him, they wounded him critically. Saul said to his armor-bearer, "Draw your sword and run me through, or these uncircumcised fellows will come and run me through and abuse me." But his armor-bearer was terrified and would not do it, so Saul took his own sword and fell on it. When the armor-bearer saw that Saul was dead, he too fell on his sword and died with him. So Saul and his 3 sons and his armor-bearer and all his men died together that same day. When the Israelites along the valley and those across the Jordan saw that the Israelite army had fled, that Saul and his sons had died, they abandoned their towns and fled. And the Philistines came and occupied them. The next day, when the Philistines came to strip the dead, they found Saul and his 3 sons fallen on Mount Gilboa. They cut off his head. They stripped off his armor. They sent messengers throughout the land of the Philistines to proclaim the news in the temple of their idols and among their people. They put his armor in the temple of the Ashtoreths and fastened his body to the wall of Bethshan. When the people of Jabesh Gilead heard what the Philistines had done to Saul, all their valiant men marched through the night to Bethshan. They took down the bodies of Saul and his sons from the wall of Bethshan and went to Jabesh, where they burned them. Then they took their bones and buried them under a tamarisk tree at Jabesh, and they fasted 7 days. This is the word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
Now, all through this book of 1 Samuel, what we've seen is how the fate of a people is tied up with their king. That's not just something that the Bible says. This is actually something that thinkers throughout the human history have noticed. Let me just give you a couple quotes that I came across this past week from ancient thinkers and how they notice this connection. As the king goes, so go the people. In philosopher Seneca, he said, "There is much light around princes. The eyes of all are turned upon them." He says everybody in the kingdom is keeping their eye on the prince. And what the prince does, they're going to be tempted to do as well. Quintilian said, "This is the condition of princes, that whatever they do, they seem to prescribe to everybody else." He says whatever a prince does, the natural inclination for all the people is just to copy them and to follow them. And I'll give you one more here. Theodoric the King. "It is easier for nature to err than for a prince to be able to form a kingdom that is unlike himself." He says the most unnatural thing, the most natural thing in the world for a kingdom to grow to become like its king. He says that's the natural order of things. And part of this is like we as human beings are social. We're a social creature. God has made different kinds of creatures. He made bears. Guys, we like bears. We think bears are cool. But bears are solitary animals. They're not pack animals. A bear spends most of its life by itself. The same with tigers. Tigers are just sort of a lone animal, spends most of its time just stalking prey and living on its own. Human beings, we are not that kind of creature. We are made to be around others. In fact, to need one another. And that's why we have such, God makes us in these tight family units. Father's Day is coming up soon. And on Father's Day, we just celebrated Mother's Day. And we remember that part of God's plan for us, to make us into the people that he wants us to be, he gives us fathers. That's part of his plan. In other words, if you don't have a father, that's a handicap that some of us have experienced. It's a handicap that you're going to have to work against for all of your life. Because God's natural design is for a father to be there to sort of guide you and show you where to go. And that's why, interestingly, in the Bible, kings are often referred to as fathers of their people. Their function is similar. What the father is to the family, the king is something like that to the people. And as we often say, like father, like son, so we can say, like king, like citizen. People tend to grow into what their king is. There's this connection. It's part of God's plan for making us into the people we should be. And this is important. It tells us this: if you want to become the person that you need to be, the answer is not to get alone by yourself or try to become the truest version of yourself or to look down deep inside or something like that or whatever modern people are thinking these days. Instead, if you want to become who you're supposed to be, what's most important of all is you find the right leader. What's most important is you find the right fathers and the right kings to take you by the hand, to lead you, to show you there is much light around princes. The eyes of all are turned upon them. Again, Seneca says. And this book has driven that lesson home for us. It has shown us King Saul as a father to the people. We have seen Saul, mainly we can say with some confidence that Saul has been a failure of a father and in many ways a failure of a king. And here comes the great crash. And here's how we know that Saul was a failure. Because when Saul dies, he takes a lot of people down with him. His sons are killed with him. Many people in his nation are killed. Many of the people flee from the land where they are. They're defeated by their enemies in battle. Saul's sin did not only affect himself, it affected his people. And we should understand that the king is kind of a reflection of the people. What were the people of Israel like at this time? Kind of like Saul. That's why Saul was the king, and that's why the whole nation ended up the way they did. We've seen, even since the earliest chapters of this book, there is something amiss. There's something rotten in the state of Israel. There's something not right in this country. The hearts of the people are not right with God. And our hope was that when Saul comes to the throne, that here's a father who's going to do something about it. Here's a father for the people who will lead them to God. And instead we find almost the opposite. And here's, you kind of see the saddest note there in verse 7. Look at verse 7. I tried to emphasize this as we read it. When the Israelites saw that the battle had been lost, what does it say? They abandoned their towns and fled. And the Israelites came and occupied them. Now, if you look at a map at kind of the territory that the Philistines kind of gobbled up here at this time, it's just like a chomp right out of the heart of Israel. Just took a big old chunk out of the middle of the land. Israel is just barely hanging on to their own borders, really. Now, that's sad whenever any people is dispossessed from their native land. That's sad. But it's extra sad for Israel because their land is not like a normal land. Israel, their kind of identity is this. If you ask an Israel, where do you live? They might say something like this. I live in God's backyard. I'm God's neighbor. I live in a duplex. God lives in one unit and I live in the other unit. God is my closest neighbor. I live with God. I see God regularly. I commune with him. I have protection because I live with God. I have blessing because I live with God. To lose the land is to lose their connection with God. And so what we see, what's the result of Saul's life? At the end of Saul's life, here's the people losing their land, losing their God, losing their identity. So this tells us what? It's going to take a much greater king than Saul to gather them before God. Now, that was God's purpose for giving them the land. God gave them the land, basically gave them a lease to the land. Say, I'm allowing you to move in with me, to live in my backyard, to have this close relationship with me. Now, the details of the story really show just what a great tragedy it is. Notice that Saul's 3 sons are killed. Jonathan, Abinadab, Malchishua. One of the saddest verses in Scripture. There's a real irony there, isn't it? Why was Saul so passionately committed to hunting down David and killing him? Because he knew David represented a threat to his own family's dynasty. How will my son be king? How will Jonathan be king if David is alive? How will my sons live to become king unless I stamp out David? So Saul goes on a mad hunt to try to kill David. In the end, what does he accomplish? His sons that he fought so hard for are lost to him. The lesson for us should be that sin, disobedience to God, living your own way, always, always, always will bring ruin upon the very things that you love. You fight for your family, you fight for your country, you're fighting for your health, you're fighting for whatever your happiness. You will ruin it if you think that disobedience to God is the path to what you want. Sin is not just a random rule. I just want to point this out. Sin is not just a random rule. It tears at the fabric of life and nature. You're fighting against nature. You're trying to succeed in sin is like trying to make the sky a different color, to try to make grass grow a different color. to try to make gravity stop working. Sin cannot work. It is a rebellion against nature. That's what it is. When Christians say, it's very important to notice, when Christians say that we're against something, Christians say, we're opposed to homosexuality or something like that, people here are saying, I don't like it. But what they should hear us saying is, that's not going to work. It's gravity. It's the sky is blue. That's right. It's a law of nature that you're rebelling against. And Saul finds this out to his detriment. And here he is. The enemies are closing in, and he's afraid of being tortured. Clearly, that's what Saul's afraid of. Saul has enemies among the Philistines. These are not normal enemies. And Saul, in these final moments, he's already been wounded by archers. You got a couple arrows sticking out of him. And Saul tells his armor bearer, his guy with him, he's like, pull out your sword and kill me. And when he won't do it for fear, Saul falls on his own sword and kills himself. Saul ends his life in despair. Now, there may be a little irony there. You think when Saul tells that guy, pull out your sword and kill me, and that guy's like, I'm not doing that. Do you think he was reminded for a second of David, who he hunted down, and David had 2 opportunities to kill Saul, had him at his mercy, and would not kill Saul, would not lay a finger on Saul. So all of a sudden, here he is in the final moments reminded of his sin against David, perhaps. Perhaps he sees somebody who's afraid to lay a hand on God's anointed king, as Saul hunted God's anointed king through the hills of Judah, as he hunted David with no fear for laying a hand on God's anointed one. Here, in the final moments, he cannot find somebody who is willing to lay a hand on God's anointed one. But let me just say, I was reading this, I was studying for this message and this lesson, and I was reading books about 1 Samuel, and I was very disturbed at how many commentators and people who study this book a lot say something like, Saul chose to end his life heroically. Well, I'm sorry, that is not at all the lesson that we should take from the end of Saul's life at all. This final moment, you're like, well, at least he went out like a hero, like a champ. That's not going out like a champ, just so you know. Ending your life like that is not the answer. And I think this suicide of Saul at the end really reflects his whole lifetime of lack of faith. Let me try to explain what I mean by that. Saul, his whole life, every mistake he's ever made, he's got this impulsive, thrashing, back and forth, can't make up his mind, lack of faith. He's worried. He doesn't believe that God is on his side. So he never believes that God is going to do what he said and come through for him. So he despairs. Sometimes he just sits there like he's lazy, like he won't dare go out to battle. He avoids battle. He won't obey God's commands. It's like he doesn't trust God any step of the way. And that leads this uneasy conscience that Saul has, where he's always thinking, I don't know if God's on my side. I know I'm a sinner. I know I've messed up. Maybe God's not on my side. This leads Saul, this uneasy conscience leads Saul to this sort of this walk with God that's by fits and by starts. Now he's trying to do something really bold and zealous for God. I'm going to do this thing for God. I'm going to swear this oath. Remember, he makes that oath that nobody shall eat. Nobody in my country shall eat until the end of the day. And then other times he's just in black despair. I don't know if you ever see that tendency in your own life, Christian, but it's not a healthy thing. But I've met Christians like that. They have an uneasy conscience. And so sometimes they're like, I'm making all these big vows to God. I'm going to start doing this. I'm going to do this every day. Every day I'm going to pray for 3 hours. I'm going to read my Bible for 2 hours. I'm going to tell 10 people about Jesus every day. I'm going to work in all these church ministries. The next week you see them, they're completely shut down. They can't do any of that. That thrashing back and forth, what that's often a sign of is this deep sense of, I don't know if God is really for me. So I'm either trying to win his approval, or I just give up because I'm there's no way I can win his approval. But there's just no steadiness in life. There's just this thrashing back for this impulsivity. That's really a sign of a weakened faith. And really, Saul's suicide, we can say, is really a reflection of that. It's a reflection of his, in the end, he can't find it in himself to trust the Lord. Let me just say, since we're on the subject, let me just say a couple words about suicide. We want to be careful about. This is something that's touched multiple families in our church over just recent months. So how should we think about this? Suicide, a lot of Christians have thought of suicide as this unforgivable sin. And I find that the reason they feel that is probably not very strong. The logic goes something like this. After we sin, we need to ask God to forgive us of that sin. If you commit suicide, by definition, you don't have an opportunity to ask God to forgive you of that sin. Ergo, there's no luck, there's no hope for forgiveness. Now, friends, suicide is a very, very serious sin, but that's not why it's so serious. The truth is, every one of us will probably close our eyes in death with some sins left unconfessed, undiscovered. As Pastor Dick said in his prayer this morning, we have sins that we are at best dimly aware of. So when you die, good news, you're going to die with some sins that have gone unconfessed to God. That is, by name or specifically owned up to God. Rather, suicide is such a grave sin because it represents the darkest, deepest despair. It is almost the polar opposite of what it means to have faith in God. It is the most devoid of faith of any action that you can imagine. Now, we want to be cautious. There may be people whose minds and souls are so splintered and broken by sin that there's some rogue part of them where there really seems to be no faith at all. And at times they can act in ways that seem to have no faith at all. They momentarily seize control of the whole man. Do people ever commit suicide on the spur of the moment in an impulsive way like Saul? Possibly. They have a momentary lapse of reason where they completely lose their faith, like the disciples on the boat with Jesus. Possibly. But this doesn't change the concern of the act. We might say it like this. We don't need to know that a person who commits suicide is not saved. But we can say that we know of no reason to feel sure that they were saved. When someone commits suicide, you ought not say something like this, but I know that they were a Christian. You should say no such thing. Because there's no greater evidence that they're not a Christian at all than the fact they commit suicide. You can still have hope in your heart. You can still take hope in your heart that the Lord knows something that you don't know, but we should at least admit our limited information. G.K. Chesterton, kids, I talked to you all about Chesterton this past Sunday at youth, and he said what I think is the most insightful thing I've read about suicide before. Chesterton said, "The suicide is the man who cares so little for anything outside him that he wants to see the last of everything." He says the suicide looks at the whole world that God created, and says, I cannot find anything worth living for. Chesterton says, the thief compliments a thing by stealing it. The assassin compliments a thing by killing it. But the suicide insults everything on earth by not stealing it, not killing it, but by refusing to live in it at all. He calls it a treason against the universe. And there's some truth there. So, will we see Saul in heaven someday? Will we walk with Saul? We can say, we don't know. But there's no good hope that this passage gives us at all. And granted, we know more about Saul than we know about most people. Either way, the effect of Saul's disobedience was certainly self-destruction. And notice that the destruction that sin wreaks in Saul's life doesn't stop when he's dead. The Philistines are just getting started. They get their hands on Saul. They cut off his head. They strip his armor. They nail him to the wall of their city. Now, what is this mutilation and this idea? Well, it was back then it was a very, very big deal to have a proper burial. This is something we don't think about much anymore. A lot of people I meet say, just cremate me and get rid of me however you got to get rid of me. But ancient people did not think like that. They said, I want to be buried with my ancestors in my homeland. Well, there's a lot of reasons we can give for that. But this is the fact that they deny Saul burial is a way of treating him like he's cast out from the people of God, like he's worthless. Part of their goal is to really rub in this defeat. Really rub it in. It's a way of saying, if we could kill him 100 times, we'd kill him 100 times. It's a way to mar his memory. When someone that we love passes away, we have all these fond memories of them. But if they go out the way Saul does, every time you think of it, you just shudder. What an awful end that loved one came to. And the Philistines want that to be the effect. They also want it to terrify and warn the Israelites, this is what you get if you stand against us. And then notice how they're still rubbing it in. They're still celebrating there in verse number 9. After they cut off his head and strip his armor. Verse 9, they sent messengers throughout the land of the Philistines to proclaim the news in the temple of their idols and among their people. They send out messengers carrying the good news, saying Saul, who killed thousands of the Philistines, is dead. Our great enemy Saul is dead. And they're celebrating, and they're sending messengers. And this was very disturbing to the people of Israel to read. If you go on to read the next chapter, which is the first chapter of the next book, 2 Samuel chapter 1, David writes a little song about how sad he is about Saul's death. And one of the first things he says is, "Tell it not in Gath, Philistine city. Proclaim it not in the streets of Ashkelon," another Philistine city. "Lest the daughters of the Philistines be glad, lest the daughters of the uncircumcised rejoice." There's no knife that twists deeper, that stings more than knowing that the Philistines are partying because Saul, their enemy, is dead. And this relates to something that's been going on in the whole book. Through the whole book, there's this kind of, we might call it the war behind the war. The war that Pastor Dick talked to us about last week. The war for God's glory. Who is really God? The gods of the Philistines or the God of Israel? When David stands on the battlefield to face the Philistines, he says, "Today everyone will know that there is a God in Israel." And he gives Goliath the Saul treatment. He falls down, he cuts his head off, and takes his stuff as a trophy. So you see, both gods are trying to take trophies from the other one. Earlier in the book, remember when the Ark of the Covenant was taken by the Philistines? They got the Ark of the Covenant, they captured it in a battle, and they put it as a trophy in the temple of their gods, just the way they put Saul's armor in the temple of their gods. They're trying to show who's the real God, and that's why this is such a tragedy for Israel. They're saying those pagans, those idol worshipers, they really think that their God has done something. They've made God look like a loser. They've made God look like someone who can't defend his people. This is a wonderful truth about God that we read in the Bible. It's actually the biggest, maybe, tension or the biggest conflict in the Bible. We know that our God is glorious beyond all reckoning. That our God is great. He's infinitely great and awesome. He's amazing. But here's what God has done. He has sworn an oath to bless and to preserve and to save sinful people like you and me and like the Israelites. And if God doesn't come through on that promise, then he will look like he's broken his word. He will look like he's unable and incapable of saving. He will look weak. He will look foolish. God has tied his honor to whether or not he can save people like you, people like me, people like the Israelites. And that's why, in some ways, 1 Samuel has the darkest ending of almost any book in the Bible. Because in this day, it's ending with the Philistines celebrating and the Philistines thinking that once and for all, they have demonstrated that the God of Israel is just a God like theirs, and in fact, their God is a little bit stronger. That's why this is unbearable. And we should know, if David had been there, this never would have happened. Right? Don't we know that? Again, Pastor Dick last week preached from 1 Samuel 17. We see what happens when David takes the battlefield against Philistines. David's got a perfect record against Philistines. David slays Philistines like it's going out of style. If David had been there this day, it would not have gone down like this at all. But because Saul has chosen to push away God's chosen king, he's left alone. Instead of having David at his side, he's left abandoned on the battlefield, and he dies in this tragic way. Now, I want you to know this is really important. We don't want to get carried away in our condemnation of Saul. We should know that if Saul was alive today, he would probably be the best. If he could be our leader here in the United States, he'd probably be the best leader that we've ever had in our history. He'd be really great, But Saul was not only a tragic figure, he was a hero of Israel. And you see this throughout the book. And one of the ways you see, we get a reminder of it, a really sweet, beautiful reminder of it right here. Here's Saul, his headless body is nailed to the wall of Bethshan. What do the Philistines do? They say, you're going to leave him there to rot so that people for years will walk by and see the bones of Saul nailed to our city wall. And the men of Jabesh Gilead catch wind of this. You say, who are the men of Jabesh Gilead? Well, we got to rewind. Do you remember back when Saul was just going to become king? And it looked like the people were like, I don't know if he needs to be our king. Do we really need a king? Is Saul really the guy? They were kind of not sold on Saul. And there was a city named Jabesh Gilead that came under attack by a cruel, evil king named Nahash. Nahash came against them, and he was going to pluck out their eyeballs and make them all be his slaves. And word of this in Israel was all mourning and crying, saying, oh no, our friends, our brothers in Jabesh Gilead, they're going to meet this terrible fate. And Saul heard about it, and he went like a madman. He called all of Israel together, and he marched, and he destroyed King Nahash and all of his forces, and rescued the people of Jabesh Gilead. And here, a few decades have gone by. Saul's headless, bloody body is nailed to the wall of Bethshan, and the people of Jabesh Gilead hear about it. And the men of Jabesh Gilead, it says in verse 11, when the people of Jabesh Gilead heard what the Philistines had done to Saul, all their valiant men marched through the night to Bethshan. That means they didn't take a break. From the time they heard about it, they headed out, and they didn't stop till they got there. They took down the bodies of Saul, his daring operation, and his sons from the wall of Bethshan. They went to Jabesh where they burned them. So they show this kindness. And what does this remind us of here at the end? Well, it reminds us that even though Saul was a flawed king, it's still a great blessing to have an anointed king from God with you. And we look at Saul and we're like, we might give him a C- or something as far as kings go. But he was God's chosen king. The Spirit of God was on him. And when Saul was on, it was on. When Saul was their king, when he was leading in faith, it was an incredible blessing to his people. And this leads us to think, could there be a greater king than him? And, also notice how that probably put an end to the celebrations in Philistia. They're all partying, they're celebrating every day, going out laughing at the body of Saul on the wall. And all of a sudden, to their shame, a little group of Israelites comes in at night, does a nighttime operation, and steals away the bodies of Saul right under their noses. That was a pretty brave thing to do, and it kind of made them look like fools, and it probably put a stop to all of their celebrations. And so again, it leaves us wondering, well, it'd be great if somebody could come and really put a stop to the Philistine celebration. Could prove once and for all that all of their gods are just idols. Someone could wipe, the people of Jabesh Gilead, they were concerned to wipe away the shame of Saul. That's why they took his body and burned it and gave it an honorable burial. They're trying to wipe away the shame of Saul's death. And they partially succeeded. But the whole book is setting us up. This book is really just sort of a setup. It's really the story before the story. Because the real story is the 2 Samuel story. It's the story of how David becomes the king. And we see how David is a much greater king than Saul was. And how he succeeds where Saul failed. And where Saul happened to succeed, David succeeded even more. David is a great king who finally puts down the Philistine threat. David has some battles with the Philistines. Go read your Bible after David. Look for Philistines. Oh, they're not really out there doing much anymore. David puts an end to the Philistine threat once and for all. All the land that's gobbled up here by the Philistines, and the Israelites have to get up and run away from their towns, David restores all of it. He makes those towns better than ever. He gets ready to set up a temple there, and that makes that the true heartland of the people of God, the place where they live with God. So he gathers the people there to God. He is another one way to say this is David is closer to that father, to that king who will protect, lead, and shape us like we need. And all throughout the book, I've tried to show you how even the story of David is setting us up for a greater story. The story of Jesus. There's a king who's even greater than David, which is good news, because David is of no good to us now. He's no use to us. David's not around to be our king or to help us. But God has raised up a greater king for us in David's son, Jesus. And this is something I want, as we've kind of reached the end, we'll be not in the Old Testament for a while after this. But I hope as we spend this time in the Old Testament that you get some idea of what we as Christians should think when we read the Old Testament. You ever read the Old Testament, reading your Bible, and just like, what are these stories about? Like, what am I supposed to think about this? Let me just tell you two things that you can always remember. I've already said them. I'll just repeat them. When you read about someone like David doing something great, you can think like this. Where David succeeds, Jesus will succeed to the ultimate degree. David does it this big, Jesus does it perfectly. David does it in part, Jesus does it in full. David does it for one generation, Jesus does it forever. David does it for his people. Jesus does it for all peoples. That's one way to think. And the other thing you should think is, when you see David mess up, as he will mess up, when you see Saul fail, and he does fail, you should say, Jesus will succeed where Saul failed. He will succeed where David failed. He will succeed where Moses failed and where Noah failed. Yes, he will succeed where our first father, Adam, failed. He will be the success story after many a failure story. So Jesus outshines everyone else, and everyone else is just a shadow, just a preview of what Jesus will be. He is the king for all. And friend, let me tell you, without him, unless you get a king like Jesus, remember Saul's problem this day on the battlefield? He's alone. Who should be by his side? His right-hand man, David, should be by his side. And without him, this is the end he comes to. But friend, let me tell you, is that story horrifying? It is as nothing compared to what your story will be like if at the end of your story, Jesus is not by your side. Oh, it'll be so much worse for you. You will watch everything that you love being lost to you. You'll realize that your name and your reputation are lost forever. The sky will grow black over you as you realize that God's curse is upon you. Evil enemies will creep closer to get their claws and their fangs into you. And you will wish to die like Saul, but death will flee from you as it fled from Saul. Such is the end of all those who reach the end without Jesus. Did you notice something about Jesus? When you hear the story about Saul being nailed to the side of a city wall, why is he there? Just to kill them. That's a shameful kind of death. And later on, another group of people would use the same kind of an execution technique, the Romans. They crucified people. And you say, well, how did they bury people after they crucified them? That's the point. Crucifixion is execution and burial in one. You leave them there to rot, to shame them, to say that they're lost to the land, they're lost to their people. To shame them, you leave them on the cross. And that's a very significant reason why Jesus dies in a way that reminds us of King Saul. He dies like a king that's been put to shame. Why? Because he's dying in our place. That's the significance of Jesus' death. He died the death that you deserved. He died the death that I deserved. It's very important as Christians that we can answer that very simple question. Why did Jesus die on the cross? And the answer is because I deserve to die that God-forsaken death. I deserve to die in that shameful way. I deserve to be put to an open shame. And instead, Jesus died in that way. But of course, there's wonderful hope there too, isn't there? Because Jesus did not stay on the cross. He was given a strange burial, wasn't he? Just the way that Saul received an unexpected burial. They took Saul down from the wall. They tried their best to give him an honorable burial. Same thing happened to Jesus. He died in the shameful way. Nobody would expect somebody who was crucified and put on a cross to receive the burial that Jesus received. He received an even more honorable burial than Saul. And that was a hint of what was coming. Jesus was buried in a rich man's tomb. And that was a way of saying, just you wait. A couple days, all the shame of Jesus' death is going to be wiped away. The shame of Saul's death was partially wiped away. The shame of Jesus' death was going to be completely reversed, completely wiped away as he rises from the dead. As he rises from the dead. And Jesus lives now forever to undo all of Saul's failures, to undo all of our failures. He does everything that David should have done, everything that Saul should have done, Jesus now does to a perfect degree. Jesus is now the right king that we need. Remember what we say about the right king. Like king, like citizen. You get the right leader, you get the right king in your life, and he's going to change your life for the better. After this study in 1 Samuel, we're going to be spending a lot of time in Galatians looking at the fruit of the Spirit. What the fruit of the Spirit is all about is, hey, these are the ways that your king is going to change your life. This is the kind of person he's going to form you into. And he's there at our side to do that. We have Jesus with us, and we either have him, we end up alone without him. If we stand with him as our king, he will transform us. He'll transform us. Let me tell you a little story about that. Yesterday was June 6th, which of course in American history is D-Day. So I was looking at some D-Day history yesterday. There's no end of courageous, heroic stories from that. There's one I hadn't heard before. Maybe you've heard of it. The oldest general involved in the D-Day operation in World War II was a guy by the name of Teddy Roosevelt Jr., the son of one of our most beloved presidents, Teddy Roosevelt. His son, Teddy Roosevelt Jr., his oldest son, was 56 years old at the time. Voluntarily joined the military again when World War II broke out. He had been in World War I, been injured in World War I, some poison gas and all this stuff. When World War II broke out, he said, I want to be there. I want to be there to support our young men. And he was one of the first people to land on the beach. He was actually the only general. That's something that generals don't have to do, land on the beach in an invasion assault. You don't have to do that if you're a general. And he said he actually asked for that. Verbally, multiple times, he said, I want to be the first wave. I want to arrive on the beach with the boys. They're like, no, you got to understand something about him. The old man, his heart didn't work. And he walked with a cane. Exactly the guy he wanted getting off the boat on the beaches of Normandy. And he finally wrote a written petition. In this written petition, he said, I believe it will steady them to know that I am with them. He was very loved by the young men. Actually, his son was also a soldier on that day, also landed on the beaches, on a different beach. So he left. He landed on Omaha Beach. He finally got permission to do that. When they landed there on the beach, they were about a mile off their target. And he came off the boat, one of the first men off the boat. He came out with his cane and his pistol in the other hand, and he scouted out their location, realized that they were way far away from where they were supposed to be. The bombs are going off all around them. He said, we'll start the war from here. And he worked all that day to make sure the landing went smoothly. He kept the men encouraged and on their assignments. He seemed to be oblivious to all the chaos around him. Supposedly, later, a GI who got off a boat said that he was very scared, but when he saw General Roosevelt walking around at the chaos, he decided, if the general's here, it can't really be all that bad. Years later, one of the Joint Chiefs, the guy went on to become one of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Omar Bradley. They asked him, what's the most heroic thing you ever saw in combat? He said, Ted Roosevelt on Omaha Beach. The guy actually died in France a month later of a heart attack. And what an inspiring story, but you got to see how similar that is to what Jesus does for us, and he stands by us in battle. He insists on coming into the battle to join us in our hour of peril. No one could have asked or expected him to be there with us under fire by our enemy. But we see in that moment, as we see Jesus approach the cross, we see how perfectly brave, how perfectly faithful he was. We see his deep care and interest in us is as he comes alongside of us to encourage us. How we were so far away from where we were supposed to be, but he said, we'll start the war from here. How different he looks from Saul on that battlefield. And like the true king that he is, he steadies us, he organizes us, and gives us our orders to lead us to victory. That's what it means to have Jesus on your side. Friend, if you try to keep your own sovereignty to be the Lord of your own life, as many of us may try to do at times, you may want to be the boss, the Lord in charge of your life. You say, I don't want Jesus or anyone else to be in charge of my life. Well, then your end will be like Saul's. There's a wonderful story of John the Baptist. Jesus is the prophet that came before Jesus to prepare the way. After Jesus was preaching and people coming to hear Jesus, they came to John the Baptist and they said, hey, are you a little jealous? I mean, everybody's going out to hear Jesus now. And John very famously said, he must increase. I must decrease. And what does he mean by that? When he says he must increase, John doesn't mean, I prefer that Jesus increase. That must means, it's going to happen whether I like it or not. It's going to happen. It is inevitable. It is the determined will of God. This is what the future holds. Jesus on the increase. Jesus on the rise. Jesus on the throne. And John says, do you think I'm dumb enough to try to get in the way of that freight train? I don't get in the way of Jesus making his way to glory. He's going to increase. And that means if there's ever a conflict between my glory and Jesus' glory, I'm going to step out of the way. I must decrease. And friends, there are many people today who refuse to become Christians. They'll not bow the knee to Jesus. They'll not make him the Lord of their lives because they refuse to decrease. They're not willing to decrease. Christian, when you're baptized, when we baptize you in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit, what are you saying? He must increase, and I must decrease. He must be the Lord of my life, not me. That's what we say. And it happens all throughout our lives. What does it mean when I say I must decrease? Christian, you must decrease. Personally, if you're not a Christian, you will tell you must decrease. When do you have to decrease? When you submit to his orders as your king. When Jesus tells you to do something, and you say, yes, Lord, and you go and do it, you're saying he must increase, I must decrease. When you rejoice at seeing his kingdom advance, you're saying he must increase, and I must decrease. When you accept hardship that he sends your way, sickness, poverty, persecution, unfair treatment, when he sends that your way and you accept it gladly, you're saying he must increase and I must decrease. When you think of all your stuff as belonging to him, your family, your work, your money, your country, etc., when you think of all that as being his, you're saying he must increase and I must decrease. So if you're not a Christian, what we would encourage you today is to bow to Jesus and to say, he's going to increase, and I welcome that. I gladly surrender to his increase. Let me just tell you a couple things, Christian, things we can take away from this passage. First of all, never lose this sight, this image of the desolation of a sinner without the King, without Jesus. And resolve, never shall I forsake Jesus Christ. Come what may, I will not walk away from Jesus Christ. And praise God, with Jesus, the enemy will never bring us to such a ruin. Your end will not look like Saul's. And that means we should never despair like Saul. Christian, watch out for that thrashing tendency we talked about, that uneasy conscience. Remember, Saul's problem was he just, day to day, he would not believe God's promises. He would not believe that God was on his side. But Christian, we have 1,000 times more reason to be confident that God is for us. And that's because of Jesus. He who gave up his son for us, shall he not with his son give us all good things? Right? If God be for us, who can be against us? What the Bible is saying is, if you see that God is for you in Jesus Christ, then nothing can be against you. There's never a reason for the black despair that we see here in Saul. I don't know, just the law of numbers in a congregation, our small congregation. There are doubtless people, brothers and sisters right now, who are walking through the hardest season of your life. And you're tempted to give in to black despair. This passage tells you have no reason to despair. Jesus is by your side and he will bring you through it. If the men of Jabesh Gilead had a good reason to stand with Jesus, how much more do you? And I'd say, fathers, it's almost Father's Day. I'll give you a little beforehand exhortation. Let's lead like Christ. Your family circumstances may not be what your family wishes they were, but you can, just like General Roosevelt there, you can tell your family, we'll start the war from here. Wherever we're at right now, this is where the Lord's put us, and we're going to work from right here. And you can lead them to have faith. Lead them to be like Christ. Like David, our focus on God's kingdom means that we should mourn when we see terrible tragedies happen in God's kingdom. We saw David's heartbreak where he said, don't tell it in Gath. I can't abide this thought that people are out there celebrating the demise of God's kingdom. Christians, be very, very cautious about siding with unbelievers against the Church of Jesus Christ, against Christians. I think Christians are way too quick to try to win points with unbelievers and say stuff like, well, no, I think the church has been wrong about lots of stuff. I think oftentimes Christians have been wrong and Christians have done a lot of damage. I was probably the first to say Christians have hurt a lot of people. What are you talking about? Man, let's be very cautious so we don't side with the Philistines against the people of God. And the last thing I'll say, we live in such a wonderful time. The Philistines run around carrying the news that they thought their God had won. Well, we have different news. Our God truly has won in Jesus Christ. And we can run around carrying the true good news to all who will hear it, that our God is victorious, that he's once and for all demonstrated that all the gods of this world cannot save, and he alone is God. Let's pray together.